It follows a bitter woman, Margaret, who mocks a black soldier, unaware that fate will soon confront her with the truth that will leave her speechless. What happens when the past comes back to challenge everything you thought you knew? Stay with us till the end to witness a powerful transformation. If you enjoy impactful and emotional stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Also, tell us in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We love seeing viewers from all around the world. And now, let's begin. The sun hung low over the small southern town, casting long shadows across the streets. The air was thick with the scent of fried food drifting from a local diner, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. The sun hung low over the small southern town, casting long shadows across the streets. The air was thick with the scent of fried food drifting from a local diner, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. Inside, the booths were filled with familiar faces. Old men reading newspapers, teenagers scrolling through their phones, and workers on their lunch break. The walls were lined with framed photos of soldiers from the town, men who had served in wars past and present. The atmosphere was warm, but beneath it lay an unspoken truth. This town, like many others, had its own way of doing things. Tradition ran deep, and not everyone was treated the same. Some people were welcomed with open arms, while others were barely acknowledged. The door swung open, and a man stepped inside. Dressed in a crisp army uniform, Sergeant Elijah Carter carried himself with quiet confidence. His presence should have commanded respect, but instead the diner fell into a hush. Some people glanced at him and quickly looked away. Others exchanged knowing looks, their expressions unreadable. Elijah had grown up in this town. He knew the stares, the whispers, the invisible line that had always separated people like him from the rest. But he wasn't here to make trouble. He was home on leave, taking a brief break before returning to his unit. All he wanted was a quiet meal before heading back to the life he had chosen, a life of service, discipline, and sacrifice. Near the counter, Margaret Whitmore sat with her coffee, watching Elijah with narrowed eyes. She was a woman set in her ways, her views passed down through generations. Her son, William, had been a soldier too, but he never made it home. His death had left her bitter, and over the years, her grief twisted into resentment. She believed people like Elijah didn't deserve the same recognition as her son. As Elijah walked toward the counter, Margaret let out a loud scoff. "Well, would you look at that?" she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "A soldier, huh? Didn't know they were just handing out uniforms to anybody these days." A few heads turned. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others smirked, waiting to see how Elijah would respond. Elijah met Margaret's gaze, his face unreadable. He had dealt with people like her before, people who believed they knew who he was just by looking at him. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him, the silent expectation that he would either lash out or walk away. He chose neither. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said simply, his voice calm and steady. He stepped up to the counter and placed his order, ignoring the tension in the air. But Margaret wasn't done. She leaned back in her chair, shaking her head. "I remember when soldiers had honor, when they fought for something real, not like these days. You probably got a desk job, don't you? Sitting around while real men do the fighting?" A quiet hush fell over the diner. Even those who agreed with her didn't seem sure if they wanted to be part of this moment. Elijah didn't flinch. He let her words settle in the air for a moment before speaking. "I served just like any other soldier, ma'am. Same uniform, same sacrifice." Margaret let out a dry laugh. "Sacrifice? Please. My son gave his life for this country. You think you know what that means?" Elijah held her gaze. and for the first time there was something in his eyes that made Margaret falter, a quiet strength, a certainty that came from experience. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "I do." The diner was silent now, the air thick with something unspoken. The waitress behind the counter hesitated before sliding Elijah's plate toward him. A group of teenagers in the back whispered among themselves, one of them pulling out a phone and discreetly recording. Margaret's expression hardened, but she didn't say anything else. She had expected anger, maybe an argument, but Elijah hadn't given her that. Instead, he had stood there, unshaken, refusing to be pulled into her bitterness. Elijah picked up his tray and walked to an empty booth, eating in silence. Around him the tension lingered, but no one spoke up. Some looked at Margaret with discomfort, others with quiet approval. Most just turned back to their meals, pretending nothing had happened. The moment had passed, but the weight of it remained, and outside the diner the world continued on, unaware that something had just shifted, something small but undeniable. Margaret sat in her booth, stirring her coffee furiously, her face twisted with annoyance. She couldn't believe the nerve of that man, walking in here like he belonged, acting as if he had earned the same respect as her son. The thought made her stomach churn. She glanced around the diner, expecting others to share her outrage, but no one spoke. A few people still shot uneasy glances at Elijah, but most had gone back to their meal. Even Eleanor, her closest friend, was looking down at her plate, avoiding eye contact. Margaret refused to let it go. She leaned toward the counter and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Back in my day, you had to earn the right to be called a hero. Now they just hand it out like a prize." It tasted worse than Margaret's words. On the battlefield, in the barracks, and even in his own hometown. He wasn't going to let a bitter woman ruin his homecoming. Though he didn't show it, the words still stung. He had spent years proving himself, working twice as hard just to be seen as equal, and yet here he was, back home, still fighting a battle that had nothing to do with war. His mind drifted back to his childhood. He remembered being a boy sitting in a classroom, raising his hand eagerly only to be ignored. He remembered being followed in stores as if he were a thief. He remembered his grandfather, James Carter, telling him stories about his time in the war, how he had fought bravely, saved lives, and yet still came home to be treated like he didn't belong. Elijah clenched his fists under the table. His grandfather had always told him, "Our service is not for them, it's for the ones who come after us." He had carried those words with him into the military, but now, sitting in this diner, he wondered if anything had truly changed. The video of the encounter, recorded by a group of teenagers in the back of the diner, quickly spread online. By the evening, it had been shared hundreds of times. Some people in town were outraged, calling Margaret's behavior disgraceful. Others defended her, saying, she was just an old-fashioned woman speaking her mind. Margaret wasn't aware of the video at first, but she could feel a shift in the way people looked at her. Eleanor seemed distant. The waitress Lucy barely spoke to her, and even her own neighbor avoided her gaze. That night, as she watched the news, a segment aired about black soldiers throughout history. It talked about the discrimination they faced, even after risking their lives for their country. Margaret scoffed and changed the channel. "I don't need a history lesson," she muttered. "Things were different back then." When Margaret finally saw the video online, she was furious. "They are making me look like the villain," she ranted to Eleanor, slamming her phone down. "I was just speaking the truth. Why is it wrong to have an opinion?" Eleanor hesitated before responding. Margaret, maybe it's not about having an opinion. Maybe it's about how you treated him." Margaret's eyes flashed with anger. "So now, you're taking his side?" Eleanor sighed. "I'm just saying, maybe you should think about what you said. William always told us to respect soldiers, didn't he?" Margaret felt a sharp pang in her chest at the mention of her son. She wanted to argue, to push back, but for the first time a small part of her felt uneasy. Over the next few days, the town felt different. Some people started speaking up, saying it was time to acknowledge the racism that still lingered. Others doubled down, saying people like Margaret had the right to say whatever they wanted. Mr. Harris, an elderly white veteran, stepped forward and spoke at a local meeting. "I fought alongside black soldiers," he said. "They bled the same as we did. Some of them even saved my life. If you can't respect that, then you don't respect service at all." Meanwhile, Elijah prepared to leave for his next deployment. He had come home hoping for a brief moment of peace, but instead, he was reminded why he had left in the first place. As he packed his bag, he wondered if things would ever change, or if men like him would always have to fight just to be seen. The day before Elijah was set to leave, the town held a small farewell gathering in his honor. It wasn't an official event, just a group of people who wanted to show their appreciation for his service. Veterans, old friends, and some of the younger generation who had seen the video came to shake his hand and thank him. Margaret stayed home. She sat by her window, watching the small crowd gather near the town square. She scoffed, telling herself it was all just for show. People only cared about this now because of the video. They didn't really respect him. But then, she saw something that made her pause. Mr. Harris, the old veteran, was there. The same man who had fought alongside her son's generation, the same man who never spoke unless he had something important to say. He was standing beside Elijah, patting him on the back like he was proud of him. Margaret looked away, unsettled. Later that evening, just as the sun was setting, she heard footsteps on her porch. She opened the door to find Elijah standing there, his uniform crisp, his posture straight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Margaret expected him to lecture her, to throw her own words back at her. Instead, he held out a small envelope. "This belonged to someone who fought just like I do," he said. "I think you should have it." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Margaret stood in her doorway for a long time, staring at the envelope. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside, she found an old, faded photograph. It was a picture of her son William, but he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a black soldier, both of them in uniform, smiling. Their arms were slung over each other's shoulders like brothers. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Underneath the photo was a letter. It was from William. The words were written in his familiar, slightly messy handwriting. As she read, tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. "Mama, I wanted to tell you about my best friend over here, James Carter. He saved my life more times than I can count. I wouldn't be writing this letter if it weren't for him. He's the bravest man I know. But when we get back home, I know things won't be fair to him. It makes me sick to think he won't be treated like the hero he is. I hope one day people like him get the respect they deserve. I hope you can see past the hate and understand what real sacrifice looks like." Margaret's breath hitched. James Carter. Elijah's grandfather. The very man she had spent years ignoring, dismissing, just like she had done to Elijah. Her hands trembled as she held the letter to her chest. William had loved this man, trusted him, and what had she done? She had dishonored his memory, spat on the very values her son had believed in. She let out a shaky breath, and before she could stop herself, tears spilled down her cheek. She had spent so many years filled with anger, blaming the wrong people. She had been blind. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt something she never thought she would: regret. She sat there for a long time, staring at the photograph, the weight of her mistakes pressing down on her. Finally, she whispered the words she had never thought she'd say. "I was wrong." Was wrong. The next morning my father's body was found. She hadn't slept much after reading William's letter. His words echoed in her mind, making it impossible to ignore the truth she had spent years refusing to see. She clutched the photograph in one hand as she walked through the quiet streets of town. Her feet carried her to the War Memorial, a place she hadn't visited in years. The names of the town's fallen soldiers were etched into stone, including William. She ran her fingers over his name, her heart aching. Then she searched for another name, one she had never bothered to look for before: James Carter. His name was there, but barely visible. Time and neglect had worn it down, making it easy to overlook. Margaret's chest tightened. This man, this hero, had been her son's best friend. He had saved William's life, and yet his name was fading, just like the respect he had been denied. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. For the first time in years, she felt something shift inside her. Not bitterness, not resentment, but something close to understanding. She knelt down and with trembling hands traced the letters of James Carter's name. "Thank you," she whispered. Later that afternoon, Margaret did something that shocked the entire town. She walked up to Elijah's family home and knocked on the door. When Elijah's mother, Mrs. Carter, opened it, she stiffened in surprise. Margaret had never spoken to her before. Not once. Margaret hesitated, struggling to find the right words. She had spent so much of her life believing she had nothing to apologize for, but now, standing here, she realized just how wrong she had been. I wanted to say," her voice faltered. She took a deep breath, gripping the letter in her hand for strength. "I said hateful things to your son, and I was wrong." Mrs. Carter's expression remained unreadable. "What changed your mind?" Margaret's throat tightened. She held out the photograph and letter. "William," she said softly. "He changed my mind." Mrs. Carter took the items and read them in silence. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with emotion. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. But something passed between them, an understanding, a shared grief, and maybe, just maybe, the start of something new. Margaret wasn't done. She reached out to Mr. Harris and the local veterans group. She started attending town meetings, pushing for a new memorial that honored all fallen soldiers, not just the ones people chose to remember. At first, people were skeptical. Some still whispered about the way she had treated Elijah, but others saw the change in her. She wasn't just talking, she was acting. A rededication ceremony was planned. When the new plaque was unveiled, it bore the full name and rank of James Carter, no longer faded, no longer forgotten. Margaret stood in the front row, watching as people placed flowers at the memorial. This time, when she looked at Elijah's family, she didn't feel resentment. She felt something she never thought she would: respect. By the time Elijah received Margaret's letter, he was already back on base, preparing for his next deployment. He was surprised to see her name on the envelope. He opened it carefully and read the words inside. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say this. Thank you for your service, thank you for your patience, and thank you for helping me see the truth. With respect, Margaret Whitmore." Elijah let out a slow breath. He hadn't expected an apology, least of all from her, but as he folded the letter and tucked it into his belongings, he realized something. Maybe people could change. Back in town, Margaret walked to the cemetery with fresh flowers. She placed one bouquet on William's grave. Then she walked a few steps over and placed another on James Carter's. She stood there for a long time, looking at the two graves side by side. The past couldn't be changed, but maybe the future still held hope. For understanding, for healing, for something better.